began with a single piece of paper, slipped under my door on Halloween morning. The invitation was handwritten, elegant and ornate, with a single sentence scrawled across the top. Join us for the most unforgettable night of your life. The morning air was crisp, the leaves crunching underfoot as I stepped outside to grab my mail. It was Halloween, my favorite day of the year, but there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't explain. As I sifted through the usual stack of bills and junk mail, a folded black envelope fell to the ground. There was no return address, no stamp, just my name written in a delicate, flowing script. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it right there on the porch. Inside was the invitation, written in the same elegant handwriting. It was an invitation to a Halloween party, but this wasn't any ordinary gathering. The location was listed as Ravenwood Manor, an abandoned mansion at the edge of town that had been the subject of countless local legends. Ravenwood Manor had always been a source of fascination for me. Growing up, I'd heard the stories, whispers of disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and a string of tragedies that seemed to curse anyone who entered its gates. But the idea of stepping inside had always been just that, an idea, something thrilling and forbidden that I'd never had the nerve to pursue. Until now, I spent the day mulling over the invitation, weighing the risks against the allure of uncovering the truth about Ravenwood. My friends Sarah and Marcus were quick to encourage me. "It's probably just a Halloween-themed haunted house," Marcus said, shrugging. "You know how people are. They'll use any excuse to make something spooky." Sarah, on the other hand, was more cautious. "What if it's not a joke?" she asked, her voice low. "You've heard the stories about that place. People don't just make up things like that." But the thrill of the unknown was too tempting. By the time the sun set, I had made up my mind. I was going. That evening, I dressed in my costume, a simple black cloak with a mask that covered half my face, and headed to the meeting spot listed on the invitation. The address led me to the edge of town, where a small group of people had gathered near a rusted iron gate. They were all dressed in elaborate costumes, their faces hidden behind masks that ranged from beautiful to grotesque. A man in a featureless white mask greeted us. "Welcome," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Tonight, you are our honored guests. Please leave your phones and any other devices here. They won't be necessary where we're going." The instructions felt odd, but no one objected. One by one, we handed over our phones, and the man placed them in a locked box. "Follow me," he said, opening the gate with a creak that sent a shiver down my spine. The path to the mansion was lined with towering oak trees, their gnarled branches stretching overhead like skeletal fingers. The moonlight barely pierced through the canopy, casting long, shifting shadows on the ground. The group walked in uneasy silence, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. And then we saw it. Ravenwood Manor loomed ahead, its dark silhouette framed by the pale glow of the moon. The mansion was massive, its once grand facade now cracked and weathered by time. Ivy climbed the walls, and several windows were shattered, their jagged edges reflecting the moonlight like shards of glass. But the strangest thing was the lights. Despite the mansion's abandoned state, its windows glowed with a warm, inviting light, as if it were alive and waiting for us. The man in the white mask gestured toward the front door. "Step inside," he said. "Your night begins now." As we entered the mansion, the air grew noticeably colder. The grand foyer was eerily pristine, its marble floors polished to a shine and its chandeliers casting soft, golden light. The Halloween decorations were meticulous. Pumpkins carved with intricate designs, cobwebs draped artfully across the walls, and a massive fireplace crackling with a roaring fire. It was perfect, too perfect. The man in the white mask addressed the group again. "There are only 2 rules tonight," he said. "Do not leave the mansion until midnight, and under no circumstances should you enter the basement." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. The man's tone left no room for argument. As the evening progressed, the mansion seemed to shift around us. Rooms that had appeared empty moments ago were suddenly filled with decorations and partygoers. A dining room we passed earlier now held a feast, its long table laden with food and drink that seemed untouched despite the growing crowd. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier with each passing moment, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move when I wasn't looking. And then, at precisely 10 o'clock, the lights flickered. The man in the white mask stepped into the center of the room, his voice cutting through the uneasy chatter. "The time has come," he said. "Let the game begin." The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. A single candle flickered to life, casting a dim glow over the masked man's face. His voice was calm as he spoke the words that would change everything. "If you want to leave, you'll have to survive." The moment the man in the white mask spoke, the room seemed to inhale. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the faint crackling of the fire. The single candle on the table flickered weakly, its light casting jagged shadows across the walls. The masked guests exchanged nervous glances, their unease growing with every passing second. Before anyone could ask what he meant, the man raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "This house is old," he said, his voice calm and measured. "It remembers everyone who has ever stepped inside. Tonight, it will decide who gets to leave." A chill ran down my spine. The words were spoken matter-of-factly, as though this was just another part of the evening's entertainment. But there was something in his tone, an edge of certainty that made it feel real. He gestured toward the dining table, now laden with an extravagant feast. "Eat, drink, and enjoy yourselves," he said. "The game begins shortly. And remember, the house has rules." No one moved. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Finally, a man in a devil costume broke the silence, laughing nervously. "This is just part of the show, right?" he asked, his voice wavering. The host didn't respond. I glanced at Sarah and Marcus, my pulse quickening. Sarah's eyes were wide, her face pale beneath her mask. Marcus tried to look calm, but his clenched fists betrayed his nerves. "This is messed up," Sarah whispered. "We should leave." "We can't," I said, nodding toward the front door. The ornate double doors were shut tight, the locks gleaming in the candlelight. He said no one leaves until midnight. Despite the growing unease, some guests began to sit at the table, their hunger apparently outweighing their fear. I followed hesitantly, Sarah and Marcus close behind. The food looked incredible. Roasted meats, fresh bread, colorful salads. But something about it felt off. The aroma was faint, almost muted, as if it were a memory of food rather than the real thing. I took a small bite of bread, my stomach twisting. It was flavorless, the texture dry and brittle, like it had been sitting out for days. I pushed the plate away, suddenly nauseous. As the guests settled into their seats, the host stood at the head of the table, his white mask reflecting the candlelight. "I see some of you are reluctant," he said, his tone almost amused. "That's good. Fear keeps the house alive." His words sent a ripple of tension through the group. I looked around, trying to gauge the reactions of the others. Some seemed genuinely terrified, while others still clung to the idea that this was all a game. But as the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere grew heavier, the faint sound of whispers drifting through the room. The first scream came from upstairs. It was sharp and sudden, cutting through the air like a knife. Everyone froze, their eyes snapping toward the staircase at the far end of the room. The host didn't react. He stood perfectly still, his mask tilted slightly as though he were listening. "What was that?" someone whispered, their voice trembling. The host finally spoke. "The house is awake," he said. "It's time." Without warning, the lights flickered again. When they came back on, the host was gone. The dining room was empty, the food on the table now cold and unappetizing. The group erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in panic. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said, his voice firm. He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the front door. Sarah followed, her breathing shallow and quick. We reached the doors and pulled with all our strength, but they didn't budge. "They're locked," Marcus said, his frustration boiling over. "What kind of sick joke is this?" Before we could respond, the chandelier above us flickered, its light dimming until the room was bathed in shadows. The whispers returned, louder now, and I realized they weren't coming from any one direction. They surrounded us, slipping through the cracks in the walls and curling around the edges of the room. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "I think everyone hears it," I said, my eyes scanning the room. The whispers were growing more distinct, forming words I couldn't quite make out. My chest tightened as a new sound joined the whispers, a faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. The scratching grew louder, and then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was one of the other guests, a woman in a harlequin mask. She stumbled into the room, her hands clutching her stomach, her breathing ragged. "They took him," she gasped, collapsing to her knees. "They took him upstairs." "Who?" Marcus asked, kneeling beside her. "Who took him?" She didn't answer. Her mask slipped slightly, revealing wide, terrified eyes. "We need to leave," she whispered. "Now." Before we could process her words, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. I reached out blindly, my fingers brushing against Sarah's arm. "Stay close," I said, my voice barely audible over the whispers. When the lights returned, the woman in the harlequin mask was gone. The room erupted into chaos, the remaining guests shouting over each other in panic. Some bolted for the staircase, while others huddled together, their fear palpable. I grabbed Sarah and Marcus, pulling them toward the corner of the room. "We need to figure out what's going on," I said, my voice trembling. "Something isn't right." "No kidding," Marcus said, his eyes scanning the room. "This place is a death trap." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the house was alive, and it wasn't letting us leave without a fight. As we debated our next move, the chandelier flickered once more, and the whispers stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, a voice echoed through the mansion, low and menacing. "The game has begun." The voice echoed through the mansion, deep and distorted, reverberating off the walls. The words, "The game has begun," were like a death knell, silencing the chaotic murmurs in the room. For a moment, no one moved. The flickering chandelier cast long, jagged shadows across the faces of the remaining guests, their masks unable to hide their growing fear. Then the scratching returned. It wasn't faint anymore. It was loud and deliberate, like nails being dragged across the walls. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, circling us like a predator sizing up its prey. "What is this?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes darted toward the staircase, where the shadows seemed to deepen unnaturally. Sarah clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't stay." I wanted to agree with her, but the doors were locked, the windows unyielding. The mansion was a cage and we were the prey. "We'll figure something out," I said, trying to steady my voice. "We just need to stay together." The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for several agonizing seconds. When they came back on, the dining table was empty. Every plate, every glass, every scrap of food had vanished. In their place was a single envelope, placed neatly in the center of the table. No one moved to touch it. What is that?" someone asked, their voice shaky. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if urging us forward. I stepped toward the envelope, my heart pounding. My fingers trembled as I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled in the same elegant handwriting as the invitation. "Find the key." The house decides who stays and who leaves. I read the message aloud, my voice echoing in the silent room. The other guests exchanged uneasy glances, their fear palpable. "What key?" Sarah asked, her voice thin and shaky. "What does it mean?" "The game," Marcus said, his tone grim. "It's part of the game." Another guest, a man in a wolf mask, stepped forward. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "I don't know what kind of sick joke this is, but I'm not playing. I'm leaving." He stormed toward the front door and pulled at the handle with all his strength. The door didn't budge. Frustrated, he pounded on it, shouting for help. The rest of us watched, frozen, as the chandelier flickered above him. And then the door opened. For a moment, hope surged through the room. But the door didn't open to the outside. It opened to darkness, complete and utter blackness that seemed to stretch infinitely beyond the threshold. The wolf-masked man froze, his hand still on the doorknob. "What is that?" someone whispered. The man didn't answer. He stared into the void, his body rigid, as if something beyond the door held him in its grip. And then, without warning, he stepped forward and disappeared. The door slammed shut behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. The man was gone, and the door looked as solid and immovable as it had before. It was as if he had never been there. "This isn't a game," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "This is something else." I clenched my fists, my mind racing. The house wasn't just playing with us, it was hunting us. And we had no way of knowing who would be next. The scratching started again, louder this time, and the whispers returned. They weren't indistinct anymore. They were voices, layered and overlapping, each one repeating the same phrase. "Find the key." The lights flickered once more, and when they stabilized, the room had changed. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. And on the far wall, another message had appeared, scratched into the wood. "Time is running out." We didn't wait for another sign. The group scattered, each person rushing to search a different part of the mansion. Sarah, Marcus, and I stuck together, moving toward the grand staircase. The whispers grew louder as we ascended, the shadows at the edges of the room twisting unnaturally. "I don't like this," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "This place, it's alive." I didn't respond. She was right. The mansion seemed to breathe, its walls shifting subtly as we moved. Every step felt like a descent into something far darker than I could have imagined. The second floor was worse. The air was colder, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper that seemed to writhe under the flickering light. Doors lined the hallway, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms filled with strange, unsettling objects. A rocking chair that moved on its own, a mirror that reflected only darkness, a doll with its head turned completely around. We didn't dare enter any of them. Instead, we moved toward the end of the hall, where a single door stood closed. "That has to be it," Marcus said, his voice low. "The key has to be in there." We approached the door cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath our feet. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers seemed to gather around us, their words growing more frantic. When we reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my heart pounding. "Ready?" I asked, glancing at Sarah and Marcus. They nodded, though their fear was evident. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, its only source of light a single candle burning on a small table in the center. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with jars of murky liquid. Floating inside were objects I couldn't identify and didn't want to. On the table lay a small, ornate key. I stepped forward, my breath catching in my throat. The key was beautiful, its intricate design glinting in the candlelight. But as I reached for it, the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The door slammed shut behind us, and the shadows in the room began to move. Something was in there with us. I grabbed the key and turned toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. Behind us, a low, guttural growl filled the air. And then, from the shadows, something moved. A shape that was impossibly large and impossibly fast. The growl seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the room. A deep, guttural sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The flickering candlelight distorted the shadows, making them writhe like living things. I clutched the key tightly, my knuckles white, as Sarah and Marcus pressed close behind me. "We have to get out of here," Marcus hissed, his voice barely audible over the growing roar. He jiggled the doorknob furiously, but it wouldn't budge. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and then the shadows in the room coalesced into something solid. A shape emerged, large, hunched, and grotesque. Its body was a mass of writhing darkness, its features indistinct except for its eyes, which glowed faintly with an unnatural, sickly light. It moved slowly at first, its massive limbs scraping against the floor, but the sheer weight of its presence filled the room with an oppressive, suffocating dread. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She clung to my arm, her breath shallow and rapid. "I don't know," I said, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing in front of us. It didn't lunge, didn't attack. It just stood there, watching, its glowing eyes shifting between each of us as if it were deciding which one to take first. The whispers that had surrounded us all night returned, louder now and more distinct. They seemed to be coming from the creature itself, a chorus of overlapping voices that echoed in my mind. "You shouldn't have come here." Marcus grabbed the candle from the table, holding it out like a weapon. The faint flame flickered weakly, but the creature didn't react. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "We're leaving. You can't stop us." The creature tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged. The room erupted into chaos. Sarah screamed, and Marcus swung the candle wildly, the flame extinguishing in an instant. The darkness closed in around us, thick and suffocating, as the creature's growls echoed from every corner of the room. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the door. Marcus was right behind us, fumbling in the dark as the creature's massive form blocked our path. I felt its presence pressing closer, its breath hot and rancid against my neck. I fumbled for the key, my hands shaking as I jammed it into the lock. The door finally gave way, and we stumbled into the hallway, slamming it shut behind us. The hallway was no sanctuary. The once pristine wallpaper was now cracked and peeling, revealing dark, pulsing veins beneath the surface. The chandelier overhead swayed ominously, its light dim and flickering. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more aggressive, as if the house itself was alive and angry. "What the hell was that?" Marcus panted, his back pressed against the door. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he clutched the extinguished candle. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking, "but it's not going to stop. We have to keep moving." Sarah pointed toward the far end of the hallway, where another staircase led down to the first floor. "We need to get back to the others," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe they've found a way out." I wasn't so sure. The mansion felt different now, as if it were actively working against us. Every step we took felt heavier, the air around us colder. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer and darker. We made our way down the stairs, the old wood creaking beneath our weight. The whispers grew fainter, but the sense of unease didn't fade. As we reached the bottom, the grand foyer stretched out before us, eerily empty. The chandelier overhead flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows across the room. The double doors were still locked, their ornate handles gleaming faintly in the dim light. The box where we'd left our phones sat untouched on a side table, but the sight of it brought no comfort. We were still trapped. "Where is everyone?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "They were all here before," "They're gone," Marcus said grimly. Or worse, the words hung heavily in the air. I clutched the key tighter, its cool metal pressing into my palm. "This has to mean something," I said, holding it up. The message said to find the key. Maybe it unlocks something important. The scratching returned, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. It seemed to echo from every corner of the room, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. "We need to move," Marcus said, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Standing here isn't going to help." "Where do we go?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with panic. "This place is a maze." The answer came in the form of another noise, a soft click, like a lock being turned. We all froze, our eyes snapping toward a small door at the far end of the foyer. It was slightly ajar, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "The basement," I said, my stomach twisting. The host's warning echoed in my mind. "Do not enter the basement," but the door seemed to beckon us, its darkness almost inviting. The key in my hand felt heavier, its ornate design glinting faintly as if urging me forward. "We don't have a choice," Marcus said, his jaw tight. "If this key fits something, it's down there." Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "He told us not to go into the basement." "You heard him, and staying up here hasn't exactly worked out," Marcus shot back. "We're running out of options." The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if the house itself were trying to force us toward the door. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "Let's go," I said, gripping the key tightly. "We have to see this through." We descended the staircase slowly, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were damp, the faint smell of mildew mixing with something far more acrid. The whispers were louder now, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a long, narrow corridor. The flickering light from a single bulb cast eerie shadows on the damp walls. At the far end of the hallway stood another door, its surface covered in strange, carved symbols. The key in my hand began to vibrate. As we approached the door, the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The key grew hot in my hand, its metal searing my skin. And then, from the shadows behind us, came the sound of something moving, slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. The corridor was suffocatingly narrow, the damp air pressing against us like a cold, clammy hand. Each step echoed through the silence, our movements hesitant and slow. The door at the end of the hall seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, its intricate symbols shifting and shimmering in the dim light. The key in my hand grew warmer with every step, its vibrations intensifying. "Does anyone else feel that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She clutched my arm, her wide eyes darting nervously around the corridor. "Feel what?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with unease. "The walls," she said. "They're breathing." I didn't want to believe her, but she was right. The walls, slick with condensation, seemed to move subtly, their surface undulating as if the mansion itself were alive. The whispers grew louder, no longer faint and indistinct but a cacophony of voices, overlapping and relentless. "We need to keep going," I said, forcing my legs to move forward. The key in my hand felt impossibly heavy now, its ornate design glowing faintly in the dim light. Behind us, the sound of movement grew louder, slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the corridor. I turned my head, but the darkness behind us was impenetrable. "Something's coming," I whispered, my voice trembling. Marcus spun around, gripping the extinguished candle like a weapon. "We don't know that," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It could just be the house messing with us." "Does it matter?" Sarah hissed. "We can't stay here. Let's just open the door and get this over with." We reached the end of the corridor, standing before the door covered in glowing symbols. Up close, the carvings were even more intricate, their patterns writhing like living things. The whispers grew louder, now clearly coming from the other side. My hands trembled as I raised the key to the lock. The metal burned against my skin, but I forced myself to push it into place. The moment it clicked, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, none of us moved. The stillness was so absolute that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, with a low, guttural groan, the door creaked open, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light from the corridor. Do we go in?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could respond, the key in my hand disintegrated into ash, falling through my fingers. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight of the mansion pressing down on us like a physical force. "We don't have a choice," Marcus said. "It's not like we can go back." We stepped inside, the darkness enveloping us completely. The door slammed shut behind us with a resounding crash, leaving us trapped in pitch blackness. I fumbled for Sarah's hand, my pulse racing as the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. A faint light flickered to life above us, illuminating the room in an eerie, dim glow. It was a circular chamber, its walls lined with grotesque carvings and symbols that seemed to shift and change when I looked at them. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, its surface stained dark with what looked like dried blood. What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Marcus moved closer to the altar, his eyes scanning the carvings. "It looks like some kind of ritual chamber," he said, his voice grim. "But for what?" The whispers grew louder, their chaotic cacophony turning into distinct words. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed around the room, overlapping and relentless, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once. And then the shadows began to move. The darkness at the edges of the room coalesced into shapes, figures with indistinct forms and glowing eyes. They emerged slowly, their movements deliberate, surrounding us in a silent, suffocating circle. "We need to leave," Sarah said, panic rising in her voice. She clutched my arm tightly, her nails digging into my skin. "There's no way out," Marcus said, his voice low. "The door's gone." I turned to look, and he was right. The door we had entered through was no longer there. In its place was a solid wall, covered in the same shifting symbols as the rest of the chamber. The figures moved closer, their glowing eyes fixed on us. One of them stepped forward, its form more solid than the others. It was tall and hunched, its body a mass of writhing darkness. When it spoke, its voice was deep and resonant, cutting through the whispers like a blade. "You have disturbed the house," it said, "and now you will pay the price." The words sent a chill down my spine. I tightened my grip on Sarah's hand, my mind racing for a way out. "What do you want from us?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "The house has chosen," it said. "One of you will stay. The others may leave." The room erupted into chaos. Sarah and Marcus shouted over each other, their voices filled with panic and disbelief. I stood frozen, the weight of the figure's words sinking in. One of us had to stay. "What does that mean?" Sarah demanded, her voice cracking. "Why do we have to stay?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one shadowy arm and pointed toward the altar. "Decide," it said, "or the house will decide for you." The shadows pressed closer, their glowing eyes unblinking. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight almost unbearable. Marcus stepped forward, his jaw tight. "This is insane," he said. "We can't just choose someone to stay here. There has to be another way." "There isn't," the figure said. "The house has rules." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the figure gestured toward the altar again. "Choose," it said, "or none of you will leave." The shadows closed in, their glowing eyes burning into us. The air was so cold I could barely breathe. And then, from the center of the room, the altar began to glow, its surface pulsing with an unnatural light. The decision had to be made, and time was running out. glow from the altar grew brighter, its pulsing light casting unsettling shadows across the room. The figures surrounding us remained silent, their glowing eyes fixed on us as if waiting for something inevitable. The whispers pressed against my mind, forming fractured sentences that I couldn't fully comprehend. But the meaning was clear. The house demanded a choice. Someone has to stay, the shadowy figure repeated, its deep, resonant voice cutting through the rising tension. Choose. Sarah clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. We can't do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. There has to be another way. There isn't, Marcus said, his voice strained. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the shifting symbols on the walls. It's not giving us a choice. Marcus, stop, I said, my voice sharp. We're not doing this. There has to be something else. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by our defiance. The house will not wait forever, it said. If you refuse to decide, it will choose for you. The oppressive weight of the room grew heavier, the air colder. The shadows pressed closer, their forms shifting and writhing. The whispers turned into a low hum, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. The glowing symbols on the walls pulsed in time with the light from the altar, their rhythm quickening as the seconds ticked by. What happens if someone stays? Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. What does the house do to them? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one shadowy arm and gestured toward the altar. The meaning was clear. Whoever stayed would be bound to the house, becoming part of its endless cycle. We can't just pick someone, Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. We need to figure out how to get out of here together. Do you think I want this? Marcus shot back, his frustration boiling over. I'm trying to keep us alive. Enough, I said, stepping between them. My heart pounded as I turned to face the figure. What happens if no one stays? I asked. The figure's glowing eyes seemed to narrow. Then none of you will leave, it said. The house does not forgive. The shadows loomed closer, their forms towering over us. The air was so cold now that I could see my breath. Each exhale a cloud of mist that dissipated almost instantly. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but the walls seemed to close in with every passing second. And then, the altar spoke. The voice was faint at first, barely audible over the whispers, but it grew stronger, resonating through the room. The key, it said, its tone low and guttural. The one who holds the key must decide. I stared at the empty space in my hand where the key had disintegrated. The figure's glowing eyes shifted toward me, and I realized what the house was trying to say. The choice was mine. The weight of the realization crushed me. My mind reeled as I tried to make sense of it. How could I decide who stayed and who left? How could anyone? I looked at Sarah and Marcus, their faces pale and terrified. They were my friends, people I trusted. How could I betray either of them? You don't have to do this, Sarah said, her voice soft but urgent. We can figure out another way. There is no other way, the figure said, its voice filled with grim finality. The house has spoken. The whispers grew louder, more chaotic, as the altar's light intensified. The walls seemed to pulse in time with the whispers, the room itself alive and impatient. I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me, crushing me under its impossible burden. I can't do this, I said, my voice trembling. I can't choose. The figure stepped closer, its massive form blocking out the faint light. Then the house will choose for you, it said. Its voice was calm, almost gentle, but its meaning was anything but. Suddenly, the room shifted. The floor beneath us cracked, and the air filled with the sound of splintering stone. The altar glowed brighter, its light searing and unnatural, and the shadows surged forward, their movements frantic and erratic. The house was growing impatient. I'll do it, Marcus shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. I'll stay. Just let them go. "No!" Sarah screamed, grabbing his arm. "You can't. It's the only way," Marcus said, pulling free of her grip. "If one of us doesn't stay, none of us get out of here alive." I tried to stop him, but the shadows moved faster. They wrapped around Marcus, their dark tendrils pulling him toward the altar. He didn't resist, his jaw tight as he met my gaze. "Take care of her," he said, his voice steady. "Make sure she gets out." "Marcus, no!" I shouted, lunging forward. But the shadows pushed me back, their cold touch searing into my skin. The figure's glowing eyes fixed on Marcus as it raised one shadowy arm. "You have chosen," it said. "The house accepts." The altar's light flared, blinding and all-consuming. I shielded my eyes, my heart pounding as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. When the light finally faded, the room was silent. Marcus was gone. The shadows retreated, their forms dissipating into the walls. The symbols on the walls stopped pulsing, their glow fading into darkness. The air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting. The figure turned to Sarah and me, its voice low and final. "You may leave," it said. The door reappeared, its surface smooth and unmarked. It creaked open slowly, revealing the faint glow of the corridor beyond. Sarah collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. I stood frozen, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened. Marcus was gone, taken by the house, sacrificed to its endless cycle. And we were alive, but at what cost? As Sarah and I stepped through the door, the whispers followed us, faint but unmistakable. And from somewhere deep within the house, I thought I heard Marcus's voice, faint and distant. "It's not over." The hallway was eerily silent as Sarah and I emerged from the chamber, the door closing behind us with a low groan that reverberated through the air. The oppressive weight that had hung over us in the basement had lifted, but it left behind a hollow, aching emptiness. Marcus was gone. The realization struck me like a physical blow, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Sarah stumbled forward, her breathing shallow and uneven. She wiped at her tear-streaked face, her hands trembling. "We left him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We left him there." "I didn't want this," I said, my throat tight. The words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Nothing I said could change what had happened. The house had demanded a sacrifice, and we had given it one. The corridor stretched before us, impossibly long and dimly lit. The glowing symbols that had marked the walls earlier were gone, replaced by smooth, unmarked surfaces that seemed to shimmer faintly in the flickering light. The whispers that had haunted us throughout the night were silent, but their absence felt ominous rather than comforting. "Where do we go now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Out," I said, though I wasn't sure if escape was even possible. The house had let us leave the chamber, but that didn't mean it was done with us. We moved cautiously down the corridor, the faint sound of our footsteps the only noise in the suffocating silence. The air grew colder with every step, and the walls seemed to close in, narrowing the already claustrophobic space. My chest tightened as a familiar sense of unease crept over me. The corridor began to twist and turn, its angles sharp and unnatural. Felt like we were walking in circles, but there was no way to be sure. The oppressive silence made time feel meaningless, and the longer we walked, the more I felt like the house was toying with us. And then we saw it. A door at the end of the hallway, identical to the one that had led us into the basement chamber. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling through the crack. Sarah hesitated, her grip tightening on my arm. Do we go in?" "We don't have a choice," I said, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back. "It's the only way forward." We stepped through the door, and the scene that greeted us sent a chill down my spine. We were back in the grand foyer. The chandelier overhead swayed gently, its light dim and flickering. The ornate double doors stood closed, their brass handles gleaming faintly in the weak glow. The box where we had left our phones sat untouched on the side table, just as we had left it. It was as if no time had passed at all. But the room wasn't empty. Standing in the center of the foyer was the man in the white mask. He turned to face us as we entered, his featureless mask reflecting the flickering light. For a moment, he didn't speak, and the silence was unbearable. "You've done well," he said finally, his voice calm and measured. "The house is satisfied for now." Sarah stepped forward, her fists clenched. "Where's Marcus?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "What did you do to him?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question. "He is part of the house now," he said, "as are all who stay behind." The weight of his words settled over us like a shroud. Marcus wasn't just gone. He was bound to the house, trapped in its endless cycle of horror. The thought made my stomach twist, but I forced myself to stay focused. "Let us leave," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. "You said the house was satisfied. That means we're free." The man nodded slowly. "The doors are open," he said. "But remember this, the house does not forget. You are marked now. No matter where you go, it will always find you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I didn't argue. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the double doors. They opened easily, revealing the cool night air and the faint glow of the moon. For a moment, I couldn't believe it. After everything we had been through, we were finally free. We stepped outside, the grass crunching under our feet as we moved away from the mansion. The towering oaks that lined the path loomed overhead, their gnarled branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air was crisp and cold, but it felt lighter than it had all night. As we reached the gates, I turned back to look at Ravenwood Manor. The mansion stood in eerie silence, its dark windows reflecting the pale moonlight. It looked almost peaceful, as if the horrors we had endured were nothing more than a bad dream. But then I saw it. In one of the windows on the second floor, a faint light flickered. A shadow moved behind the glass, tall and familiar. My heart stopped as I recognized the figure. It was Marcus. He stood motionless, his face obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his gaze locked on me. The weight of it was almost unbearable, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Sarah turned to look, her eyes widening as she followed my gaze. "No," she said, shaking her head. "There's nothing there," but I knew what I saw. Marcus was still in there watching us, and somehow I knew he always would be. As we walked away from the mansion, the wind carried a faint whisper. "You'll come back." I didn't look back, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The walk away from Ravenwood Manor felt like traversing a dream, a cold, fragmented dream that refused to end. Sarah clung to my arm, her grip trembling as if letting go would cause her to vanish into the night. I didn't look back, not after seeing Marcus's shadow in the window, but the image was burned into my mind, haunting every step I took. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. The gate to the mansion creaked as it swung shut behind us, its echo reverberating through the still air. I stopped just outside, staring into the dark forest that surrounded the path. "Do you think it's really over?" Sarah asked, her voice soft and raw. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. "I don't know," I admitted. The words felt hollow. The truth was, I didn't believe it was over. Not after everything we had seen. Not after what the man in the white mask had said. We made it back to the main road just as the first hints of dawn began to break over the horizon. The pale light of the morning felt out of place, washing over the town like a fragile promise of safety. But even as the sun rose, the weight of the night lingered, pressing down on my chest like a stone. Sarah and I parted ways without much discussion. She hugged me tightly, her tears dampening my shoulder, and then she was gone, disappearing into the quiet streets. I didn't blame her for wanting to be alone. I felt the same. I needed time to process everything, to figure out what came next. But I didn't make it far before I realized something was wrong. The first sign was the cold. Despite the sun's gentle warmth, the air around me felt unnaturally icy, like a winter breeze that had no business being there. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, looking around, but the street was empty. The houses were dark, their windows like empty eyes staring back at me. And then I heard it, the whispers. They were faint, barely audible but unmistakable. The same whispers that had followed us through the mansion. My heart raced as I turned in a slow circle, scanning the empty street. There was no one there, but the whispers didn't stop. "You'll come back." I hurried home, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My apartment was just as I had left it. Small, cluttered, and achingly normal. The sight of it should have been comforting, but instead, it felt wrong. The air inside was heavy, the familiar space suffocating in its stillness. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my chest heaving. The whispers had stopped the moment I stepped inside, but their absence only made me more uneasy. Felt like the calm before a storm. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the memories of the night came rushing back. The shadows, the whispers, the glowing symbols on the walls. And Marcus, always Marcus, his shadowed figure watching me from the window. When sleep finally claimed me, it was anything but restful. My dreams were vivid and fragmented, filled with dark hallways that twisted and turned endlessly. The whispers were there too, louder now, repeating the same phrase over and over again. "You'll come back." I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the faint light of the moon spilling through the window. For a moment, I thought I was back in the mansion. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift when I looked at them. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the foot of my bed, its form indistinct but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, frozen. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head slightly, the movement unnaturally slow. And then it was gone, vanishing into the shadows as if it had never been there. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching my knees to my chest, my eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had stood. The whispers returned, faint and intermittent, scratching at the edges of my mind. By morning, I was exhausted, but the daylight brought little relief. The figure didn't return, but its presence lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even when I was alone. Over the next few days, the signs became impossible to ignore. The temperature in my apartment fluctuated wildly, swinging from stifling heat to bone-chilling cold. Objects moved on their own, small things at first like keys and cups, but then larger items like furniture. The whispers grew louder, their words becoming clearer. "You'll come back." I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was all in my head. But the truth was undeniable. The house hadn't let me go. It had followed me, its influence seeping into every corner of my life. I called Sarah, desperate for reassurance, but she didn't answer. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened to her. My attempts to reach her over the following days went unanswered, and my fear only grew. And then the dreams started again. They were worse than before, more vivid and terrifying. I dreamed of Marcus, his shadowed figure standing in the mansion's window, his voice echoing in my mind. "It's not over." I dreamed of the man in the white mask, his featureless face looming over me as he whispered, "The house will find you." When I woke, the whispers were always there, waiting. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the temperature plummeted. The air grew heavy, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. And then, from somewhere behind me, I heard Marcus's voice. "You should have stayed." The sound of Marcus's voice froze me in place, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a memory or an echo. It was here, in my apartment, clear and unmistakable. The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. "You should have stayed." I turned slowly, my pulse racing, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The shadows in the corners shifted unnaturally, stretching and curling as if alive. The air grew colder with each passing second, my breath visible in the pale light of the moon filtering through the window. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no answer, only the silence, thick and oppressive, broken by the faint creak of the floorboards behind me. I couldn't stay in the apartment. Grabbing my coat, I fled into the night, the whispers following me into the empty streets. The cool air hit my face, but it did little to clear the weight in my chest. I needed answers, something, anything that could explain what was happening. And I knew exactly where I had to go. Ravenwood Manor. The thought of returning filled me with dread, but the house was the source of everything. It was the only place that might hold the answers I needed. My steps were hesitant at first, my resolve wavering with every shadow I passed. But the whispers urged me forward. They weren't just background noise anymore, they were guiding me. The road to Ravenwood was dark and empty, the streetlights dimmer than I remembered. The towering oaks that lined the path swayed in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones. The gates loomed ahead, their iron bars gleaming faintly in the moonlight. To my surprise, they were open. I stepped through, my heart pounding as I approached the mansion. It looked just as it had the night I first arrived. Dark and foreboding, its windows reflecting the pale glow of the moon. The air was heavy, the silence almost deafening, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. The front door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for me. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but the whispers had grown louder, more insistent. "Come back." Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The foyer was unchanged. The chandelier overhead swayed gently, its light flickering as if moved by an unseen hand. The air was colder inside, carrying the faint scent of decay. The grand staircase loomed before me, its wooden steps creaking softly as I stepped inside. And then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall, smooth and unmarked. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. The house had taken me back. This time, I wasn't leaving without answers. The whispers grew louder as I ascended the staircase, guiding me toward the second floor. The hallways were darker now, the walls lined with shifting shadows that seemed to watch my every move. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound distorted and elongated, as if the house itself were alive. At the end of the hall, a single door stood open, faint light spilling through the crack. My heart raced as I approached, the whispers forming distinct words. "He's waiting." I stepped inside. The room was large and dimly lit, its walls covered in the same grotesque carvings and shifting symbols I had seen in the basement. In the center of the room stood a familiar figure, Marcus. He looked unchanged, his face pale but resolute. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw relief flicker across his expression. But there was something else, something darker. "You came back," he said, his voice low and even. "I didn't have a choice," I said, my voice trembling. You're still here." Marcus nodded slowly. "I'm part of the house now," he said. "I told you, it's not over." I stepped closer, my chest tightening as I took in the room. The symbols on the walls pulsed faintly, their glow casting eerie shadows across Marcus's face. "Why did it let me leave?" I asked. "Why didn't it just keep me here?" Marcus's expression hardened. "The house doesn't just take," he said. "It marks you. Once you're marked, it doesn't matter where you go." It will always find you. The weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. Then why bring me back? Because you're part of this now, Marcus said, his voice grim. The house has plans for you. Before I could respond, the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. The symbols on the walls flared with light, and the shadows in the room began to shift and writhe. Marcus stepped back, his expression unreadable. You need to leave, he said, his voice urgent. Now? I can't, I said, panic rising in my chest. The door? There's another way, Marcus said, cutting me off. He pointed toward a faint outline in the far wall, a hidden passage that seemed to shimmer in the flickering light. Go. Before it's too late. The shadows surged forward, their movements frantic and erratic. I hesitated, my gaze flicking between Marcus and the passage. What about you? I asked. I'm already part of the house, he said. You can still get out. But you have to go now. The shadows closed in, their glowing eyes burning into me. I didn't have time to argue. Clutching the faint hope Marcus had given me, I turned and ran toward the passage. The hidden door opened as I approached, revealing a narrow, winding staircase that descended into darkness. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on me. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a familiar corridor, the basement. The symbols on the walls were dimmer now, their glow fading as I moved forward. The altar was gone, replaced by an empty, circular chamber. And then I heard Marcus's voice again, faint and distant. You'll come back. The chamber began to collapse, the walls shaking violently as the symbols on the walls flared one final time. As I scrambled toward the faint outline of another door, the whispers turned into a roar, and a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, blocking my path. The chamber shuddered violently, the walls quaking as chunks of stone and debris fell from the ceiling. The shadowy figure at the far end of the room grew more distinct, its towering form blocking the only visible exit. Its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, locking onto me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. The whispers were no longer a background hum. They were a deafening roar, overlapping voices screaming in an incomprehensible cacophony. The air was thick and suffocating, the weight of the house pressing down on me like a physical force. I stumbled forward, the floor shifting beneath my feet as I tried to keep my balance. The figure moved closer, its hulking mass blotting out the faint light from the glowing symbols on the walls. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but there was nowhere to go. The figure stopped a few feet away, its presence overwhelming. It raised one shadowy arm, pointing directly at me. When it spoke, its voice was a guttural blend of whispers and growls. You should have stayed. My chest tightened as I forced myself to stand tall, gripping the walls for support. I didn't ask for this, I said, my voice trembling but defiant. I just want to leave. The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. There is no leaving. You are part of the house now. A surge of anger welled up inside me, fueled by fear and desperation. No, I said firmly. I'm not staying here. I'm not becoming part of this thing. The figure stepped closer, its shadowy form expanding to fill the chamber. The glowing symbols on the walls began to flicker and fade, their light swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The air grew colder, the whispers louder. But then I remembered Marcus's words. There's another way. I scanned the chamber, searching for anything that could lead to an escape. The faint outline of a door caught my eye, a narrow, hidden passage obscured by the shifting shadows. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. My heart raced as I made a decision. I had to get to that door no matter what. The figure moved again, its massive form blocking my path. Its voice rumbled through the chamber, shaking the very walls. The house does not let go. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Watch me. With a burst of adrenaline, I lunged toward the passage, my feet slipping on the unstable ground. The figure roared, its shadowy limbs lashing out as the chamber erupted into chaos. The glowing symbols flared one last time, their light clashing with the encroaching darkness. I ducked beneath one of the figure's limbs, the cold touch of its shadow brushing against my skin like ice. Pain shot through me, but I didn't stop. I scrambled toward the door, the whispers and roars blending into a deafening crescendo. The moment I reached the door, the ground beneath me cracked, a jagged fissure spreading through the chamber. The figure let out a final, enraged scream as the shadows surged forward, trying to pull me back. I pushed the door open and stumbled through, my heart pounding as the whispers abruptly ceased. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by an eerie silence. I found myself in a long, narrow hallway, its walls smooth and unmarked. The air was still, almost too still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I didn't stop to question where I was. I ran, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silence. The hallway twisted and turned, its angles sharp and disorienting. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body aching from the strain, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let the house catch me again. Finally, I saw it. A faint light at the end of the hallway. It was distant, flickering like a flame in the wind, but it was there. Hope surged through me, pushing me forward. The light grew brighter as I approached, illuminating the rough edges of the hallway. It wasn't a flame. It was the moonlight, spilling through a small, arched doorway. I stumbled through the opening and into the night, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. I collapsed onto the grass, my chest heaving as I gasped for breath. The world around me was silent, the towering oaks swaying gently in the breeze. Ravenwood Manor loomed behind me, its dark silhouette framed by the pale glow of the moon. I was outside. I had made it out. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over. The whispers were gone, the oppressive weight lifted. But as I lay there, staring up at the sky, a familiar chill crept over me. I sat up slowly, my gaze drifting back to the mansion. The windows were dark, reflecting the moonlight like mirrors. But in one of them, on the second floor, a faint glow flickered. A shadow moved behind the glass. My heart sank as the realization hit me. The house wasn't done with me. It never would be. Marcus's words echoed in my mind. You're part of this now. The house doesn't let go. I stood, my legs unsteady, and began walking down the path toward the gates. The cool breeze rustled the leaves around me, carrying with it a faint, familiar whisper. You'll come back. I didn't look back. As I walked away, the whispers faded, replaced by silence. But deep down, I knew the truth. The house wasn't finished. It was waiting, and one day, I'd have no choice but to return.